When people in Washington start saying, declare victory and get out, while the missiles are still coming in, I know exactly what that means. It means the war is already lost in the one way that matters. Not lost because American aircraft vanished. Not lost because Iran marched into Tel Aviv. Lost because the people who launched the war are beginning to understand that there is no political future here that they can still call victory. That is where we are now. And I think most people still do not understand how serious that is. They are still watching this war as if it were a scoreboard. How many missiles were fired? How many were intercepted? How many sites were struck? How many officials were killed? They are still looking for a single dramatic turning point. That is not how this kind of war works. This kind of war turns when the assumptions underneath it stop working. And the central assumption underneath this war was simple. Israel could absorb the retaliation. America could control the escalation. Iran would eventually crack. All three assumptions are now failing. Start with the most obvious one. Israel's air and missile defense is no longer doing what it was supposed to do. That is not a side issue. That is the center of the war, because missile defense is not just a military system. It is a political and psychological system. It tells the public they can go to sleep. It tells investors the state is still stable. It tells allies the war remains manageable. It tells enemies that however many missiles they fire, the pain will remain limited and the balance of fear will stay on one side. Once that belief starts to break, everything changes at once. And that is what is happening. Now, the missiles Iran is using do not even need to come in huge numbers anymore. This is the part people keep missing. If the payloads are large enough, if the guidance is good enough, and if the defenses on the other side are already straining, then 10 missiles can do the political work that once required 50 or 100. That changes the whole equation. This is no longer only a volume war. It is a precision war. It is a confidence war. It is a war in which the side under pressure no longer needs endless spectacle. It only needs enough successful strikes to make the population understand that the shield is not absolute. Once that understanding enters public life, it becomes very hard to reverse. And then there is the second problem, which is just as serious. Large parts of the Iranian missile infrastructure, especially in the east, have not been meaningfully touched at all. The underground facilities remain, the reserve capacity remains. The war you are watching on television is not the whole war. A large part of the system that matters most is still alive. That means time is not automatically working for Israel or for the United States. If anything, time is beginning to work against them. Every extra day now means more military cost, more economic cost, more psychological cost. That is why I listen very carefully to the language coming out of Washington. At the beginning, it was all confidence, shock, punishment, resolve, decisive action. Now the language is changing. Now people close to power are floating the language of exit. Declare victory, bring the men home, stop this before it gets worse. That kind of language never appears by accident. It appears when people inside the system have begun to understand something they do not yet want to say openly. There may be nothing left to win. That is the real turning point. And the reason this has happened is that the war was launched on a foundation of ignorance and arrogance. Ignorance because Washington still did not understand Iran. Arrogance because Washington and Israel and enough fear would produce submission. But Iran is not a brittle little client state. Iran is Persia. It is a civilizational state with a long memory, a strong sense of identity, and a political society that may disagree internally on many things but will not accept strategic humiliation from outside powers, because outside powers have better aircraft. That matters. It matters because the demands that were placed on Iran were impossible from the beginning. Give up enrichment. Give up your ballistic missiles. Give up your regional network. Accept Israeli military and political supremacy. Accept American enforcement of that supremacy. In other words, surrender your sovereignty, surrender your deterrent, surrender your strategic future, and trust the people threatening you. No serious Iranian government could ever accept that and survive. So the war began from a false premise. It began from the fantasy that enough bombing could make Iran accept political terms no serious state would ever accept voluntarily. That is why I keep saying there was no real strategy here. And when there is no real strategy in war, there is no real end to the war. There is only escalation followed by improvisation. That is exactly what we are watching now. The military facts are ugly enough, the economic facts are worse. For decades, the American empire depended on a very simple bargain. Gulf oil would be sold in dollars. Those dollars would be recycled into American assets, especially treasuries, that helped sustain the financial and military architecture of American power. People call this the petrodollar system as though it were some abstract technical matter. It is not. It is one of the hidden foundations of the entire imperial order. So what happens if the oil and gas system in the Gulf begins going offline for months at a time? What happens if the terminals are vulnerable, the routes are insecure, and the protector who promised to secure the whole arrangement is exposed as unable to guarantee it? Then the problem is not just higher energy prices. The deeper problem is that the whole political story behind the petrodollar starts to weaken. That is why this war is larger than Israel and Iran. The Gulf monarchies bought protection. That was the bargain. They aligned themselves with Washington because Washington promised that when things became serious, the shield would hold and the routes would stay open. Now they are discovering something much uglier. The missiles still get through. The routes are not secure. The Houthis could not be suppressed. Iran cannot be brought to heel. And the very region that was supposed to demonstrate the durability of American power is now exposing its limits. Once the clients begin to doubt the protector, the whole system starts changing. And once the system changes, the consequences stop being regional. They become global. That is why the pressure in Washington is no longer just military. It is financial, it is political, it is civilizational. People are beginning to understand that if this continues, the world is heading not toward some manageable regional war, but toward a serious economic break. Possibly something worse. Europe is already fragile. Asia is already fragile. Debt is already enormous. Currencies are already under pressure. So if you add a prolonged Gulf shock on top of that, you are not talking about turbulence. You are talking about systemic danger. That is why Trump wants out. I do believe that. I think he has finally understood that there is no meaningful victory left here, but wanting out and being able to get out are not the same thing. How does he back away when Israel is in visible trouble? How does he back away when Congress has spent years being politically and financially aligned with every maximalist Israeli demand? How does he back away after using language so absolute that any retreat now looks like weakness? That is the trap. He wants an off-ramp. But the political structure around him punishes realism. And so the next phase is going to be about mediation, private messages, indirect channels, quiet deals, frantic attempts to stop the bleeding without publicly admitting how badly misjudged this entire war was. Because make no mistake, the misjudgment was total. Take regime change, that fantasy is now deader than ever. This war has made regime change less likely in the near term, not more likely. That is one of the oldest strategic mistakes in history. If you want internal change inside a rival state, direct military attack often delays it. Bombing produces nationalism. It forces cohesion. It turns critics into patriots. That is exactly what has happened here. Whatever internal differences existed inside Iran, the war has. So not only has regime change failed, the war itself made regime change harder. That is another sign that the original strategy collapsed under its own contradictions. Then there is the munitions problem. People misunderstand this all the time. Yes, the United States still has large stocks of ordinary munitions. But that is not the issue. The issue is the expensive, specialized systems, the advanced interceptors, the missile. Defense architecture required to keep a technologically superior military and its allies alive against a serious missile power. Those stocks are not infinite, and the industrial base behind them is not built for a long missile war. America built itself for short wars of punishment. It did not build itself for prolonged industrial wars against resilient states that understand attrition. Iran understands attrition. Russia understands attrition. China absolutely understands attrition. That is why the production question matters so much. In a long war, the side that can regenerate enough pain faster than the other side, can regenerate enough protection, begins gaining the advantage, even if it began weaker. That is how long wars are decided, by endurance, by production, by patience, by political will. And that is also why the comparison to the Houthis is so humiliating for Washington. If the United States could not suppress a much weaker actor in Yemen, why did it imagine it could compel a civilizational state of more than 90 million people to surrender? That was never serious analysis. That was fantasy. And fantasy does very badly in long wars. Now let me say something darker. There's always one more step available when conventional assumptions collapse. Israel has nuclear weapons. I do not say that lightly, and I do not say it because I think it happens tomorrow. But once conventional options stop producing control, leaders begin staring at doors they previously called unthinkable. If Netanyahu reaches a point where conventional time no longer looks survivable, then the temptation to look toward taboo, breaking escalation rises. If that ever happened, the consequences would not be regional. They would be world historical, because many powers on Earth would not tolerate the normalization of nuclear use in this conflict. That is why this war now exists inside a much darker zone than most commentary admits. So, where does this go? Look at the structure. No realistic end state. No credible path. No clean ground option. Missile defenses degrading. Munitions stress rising. Energy shock deepening. Petrodollar credibility weakening. Allied confidence fraying. Domestic political will eroding. That is not the beginning of victory. That is the anatomy of imperial retreat. And that is why the real question now is not whether Israel can win. The real question is how much more pressure this entire structure can absorb before the illusion finally breaks. Because once the illusion breaks, events move very fast. And if you want the whole story compressed into one line, it is this. The nightmare is not that Israel and the United States were hit harder than expected. The nightmare is that they are finally discovering the war they chose cannot produce the future they demanded. And once a war reaches that point, the ending may still take time, but it is already written into the structure.